to another episode of the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. I don't get the opportunity to interview a best-selling author every single day. However, in today's episode, I had the honor of interviewing best-selling author Dennis Galloway. Dennis is the author of several books, most notably the Pen series of fantasy novels. Although Dennis has written books in historical fiction, nonfiction, and children's book categories in addition to fantasy. I'm here with Dennis Galloway, the author of the Pen series of novels. Dennis, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name's Dennis Galloway. I'm an author, #1 bestseller for my series, The Pen. Sultan's Wisdom is the first one. And I have a second book, again titled The Pen, but the subtitle is Knights Templar Treasure. So both of those are out now, and I'm working on my third. So this is going to be a series of exciting historical fiction.
Now, the biography on your Amazon author page and on the About the Author page on the website for the Pen series lists you as having lived in many places around the world. Where are some of the places you've lived?
Oh, wow. Well, when I was young, I lived in Germany, going to kindergarten, because my father was in the military, and so he was stationed over there about 8 years after World War II ended. And so when I started school, I started over there. As I grew up and traveled some more, we lived in Alaska for a while it was still a territory before it even became a state. So I was out there with the Eskimos in the cold weather. And then as I moved on in my career as an adult, I traveled overseas to Japan and Hong Kong and Korea, places like that. Interesting things, as well as continuing to travel a little bit in Europe. So, yeah, I've had a lot of exposure to other cultures. That's true.
Yeah, my older brother was stationed in Germany for a couple of years in the U.S. Army, many years after your father served, like in the 1990s.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, I served there again when I was in the military. In the late 60s, early 70s.
Now, and thank you for your service to the United States of America.
You're welcome.
Without spoiling too much of the first book in your series, what is Sultan's Wisdom about?
Well, it concerns the main character who was, let's say, middle-aged or in his 30s, mid-30s to late 30s, so wasn't quite middle-aged, but he was in a job he didn't like, and he was kind of a recluse, but he liked to write. So what he liked to write with was old pens. So he would go to the shops, gift shops, throwaway shops, and try to find an old pen that he could use. And he ran across a strange shop, antique shop, sort of like, if you think of Harry Potter's wand shop, sort of like that, dark with lots of shelves and kind of dusty. And he found a pen. So he took this pen home, started writing with it, and all of a sudden the pen took over and started writing its own story, and he had a hard time stopping it. Well, what he found out later, especially when he went to sleep, he would time travel back in time to the original owner of the pen. And the original owner of the pen was telling his story of his life, his memoirs. He was kind of writing them down. And so it told his story of being an orphan on the streets of Cairo trying to just survive until he went through his growing up, teenage years, being chased, finding a love, battling crocodiles. I mean, this guy went through a lot of stuff. So Harold, the main character, when he dream traveled back in time, he actually witnessed this. He was actually there, although in his time travel he was kind of invisible. Nobody could see him or anything, but he could certainly influence events. And he learned from this man his growing up and what he went through, lessons you learn in life, like believing in yourself, like being true to friends, things like that. And he applied those to his own life in his own time period, and he improved his life, and therefore he also enriched his life as he was following 1,000 years before the man who had the pen originally. So it was really a challenge to write. It was fun to write, and I put a lot of adventures in there.
Now, without spoiling too much of the second book of the series, what is Knights Templar Treasure about, and is it a continuation of the storyline in Sultan's Wisdom, or is it a separate storyline of its own?
It's actually a separate story of its own, because the connecting factor is this antique store that kind of shows up. And it's a story about the people who get the pen and how the use of that pen improves their lives. So this second one has to do with a divorced woman in the late 1930s in Edinburgh, just as World War II was starting to really pound on England. And it was about her finding this pen and the adventures she had. Now, she went and time traveled back to the Knights Templar, where she saw this Grand Master writing his memoirs about his life and what he went through as a young boy growing up and all the challenges he had. So a lot of that transferred to her learning these different life lessons that he learned to her life, and therefore she improved her life. But the twist on this second one is she actually goes on the hunt for the Knights Templar treasure, and she gets clues from this man who lived several hundred years before she did about where it might be. And so part of this second book is trying to find that treasure.
Now, in addition to the Pin series, you've also written a children's book called The Green King and a nonfiction book called Ask Questions to Get What You Want.
Yes.
Without spoiling too much of those books, what are those books about, and what are some of the biggest adjustments you've had to make from writing one type of book to a completely different type of book?
Well, writing the children's book was a lot of fun because it talked about this little green frog that would go happily from one pond to another on his little travels, and he ran across this pond that had a big bullfrog, and this big bullfrog dominated everything. So the little green frog had to figure out how to not be eaten and yet figure out how to help his friends that also were in the pond. So that was a lot of fun. And the challenge there was illustrations. I wrote the book in a couple of months, but it took me 4 or 5 months just to illustrate the book. So that was really what slowed me down on getting that one out. But I've written another book that's called Rebel Justice. And it had to do with a Western that was just after the close of the Civil War. There was a lot of change going on in our country. And this follows a man who was in the Confederate Army who was disbanded, of course, and he went home, but he found his home destroyed. And it turned out that after the Civil War, there was a lot of chaos in the South. There were a lot of roaming bands of gangsters, so to speak, and they wiped out his home. So he was trying to find out who did it. So this whole thing revolves around the history that changed at that time and how he moved out to Texas to find this guy. But on the way, he got lost in the desert. He almost got hung for shooting the wrong guy and had to fight Indians. And it was all kinds of adventures all rolled into one.
Now, are all your books self-published, or all your books traditionally published, or some self-published and others traditionally published?
Well, some are self-published. That's how I started out, because it was the easiest and the least costly to do. And then having Aviva Publishing come on the scene was really good, because out of New York is where she's based. It gives me a lot more credibility as an author, and also credibility on my works. Plus, if you want to get listed as bestseller, they will not look at you if you're a self-publisher. Most things like New York Times or USA Today, they want somebody that's published traditionally. So I have a combination of both, and that always helps.
Now, if you have a typical writing routine, what is your typical writing routine like?
Well, my typical writing routine is to write when I'm most creative, and that's usually in the mornings, especially after I have a good cup of coffee, well rested, and don't have much on my mind. In fact, what I try to do is set myself up so everything else can be held off for a while, and then I can concentrate just on writing. And that really has been the benefit of doing that. It's really allowed me to continue to work on my book so that I can get it out and get it done.
Sultan's Wisdom, which is the first book in the Pin series, involved two different and interrelated story arcs. How much of a challenge was it for you to keep the story coherent in a multi-arc novel?
That was a challenge, I have to admit. Sometimes I'd be writing along on one character's story arc and I say, wait a minute, I got to stop and switch over to the other guy because something's going on there too. And I don't want to be on one character too long because then the reader will get so absorbed in that story arc, they'll forget about the first one or however that worked. So I would go in and out of the dream travel by the main character waking up and finding that, oh, what's this in my hand? It must have been from when I was traveling in my dreams. And then when he would start to write with the pen and it started taking over, he'd fall asleep and then he would go on his dream travel back in time. So there was a vehicle there for me to switch between story arcs by having an event that the main character initiated, and that event in the second arc would come to an end, like the end of a day or end of a week or the end of an event. And it would throw him back to his own time. So that's the way I was able to go back and forth.
Now, I have one final question written down, but before that, you mentioned your book, Rebel Justice. That's quite an interesting concept because Reconstruction in a lot of history textbooks usually isn't presented from the South side of things because the South lost the Civil War. And I find it interesting you kind of interlink Reconstruction and the Old West.
Well, what happened at that time is a lot of Confederates needed something to do. At least their hometown might have been gone, or their job they had before, or their farm might not be available. So a lot of them did head west because west was still kind of an open territory. It was kind of lawless. There wasn't much going on in that way. So they had more choices. A lot of Confederates moved out that way, as well as a lot of free slaves. A lot of blacks moved out west because they could get land. They could start their own farm. And Texas was very, very open to that. At the time, they were trying to grow their state. What was really good at that time was the cattle industry started up because people up in the north loved to have their steaks and their beef, but it was only like local from Pennsylvania or Maryland. And so the guys down in Texas had a great opportunity if they could just get the cattle up to the states that processed the steaks, so to speak, like Indiana.
Or Nebraska.
Nebraska, right. So there were these big cattle barons, and what they would do is they would contract with the guys down in Texas. Now, what's cool about that is that time, all the steer and the cattle were scattered because nobody had been taking care of them during the Civil War. And a lot of them were scattered down in Mexico. So what these guys would do is they'd go down and wrangle them up, round them up, bring them up to Texas, and get them ready to drive up a trail. And the most famous one, of course, is the Chisholm Trail. And that was used a lot. In fact, that episode of history only lasted about 20 years. It was really short because cattle drives at the beginning had to drive them 800, 900, 1,000 miles north until the railroads started building more and more links further south. Then they didn't have to drive them as far. So it was an interesting period of history.
Now, according to your biography, you have experience acting and working behind the camera in Hollywood productions. What are those experiences like, and how have they helped you as an author?
Wow, that's a good question. The experiences gave me an insight as to visually and sound-wise and story-wise what attracts people's attention, what keeps them focused on what you're trying to present. Any media where you're trying to tell a story has to have certain kinds of elements to it to keep the reader interested. And I saw a lot of people behind the scenes working to make things happen. I mean, you'd be surprised at the thousands of people involved just to make like Grey's Anatomy, for example. You got the people with the costumes, people with the set, people with the equipment, people with the cameras. I mean, you're talking a lot of people, and it's a machine, and you get plugged into this machine, and you know where you got to stand, you know what you got to do or not do, or where you have to wait. So you get a real flavor of what that industry is about, a real understanding of the people that struggle, some that win, some that fail. And you see it on the streets in Hollywood. You see a lot of failures in the streets of Hollywood.
Well, Dennis, that was my final question for this interview, so I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
You're welcome. I try to give people insights from the book, which insights have a lot of life hacks in them, telling people how to believe in themselves and what to do about that. And I'm right now doing a weekly webinar for life hacks for doing where I present to people some ideas of what they can do to improve their lives. So you can find out more of that information if you just go to my site, mastermindsetlife.com, and I'll put the link there and everything. But I'm trying to get all this out in my books as well, and that's why I'm bringing it up. It's because it's connected.
As someone who is currently writing multiple books across many different genres myself, it was a great honor to interview a multi-genre author like Dennis. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/author AAC. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at author AAC and on Instagram at AAC Scribe. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.